Well, Walter, thank you for joining us. And it's really a genuine honor to have this conversation with you. You come really with a tremendous amount of experience and insight. Of course, your recognition by MacArthur really is really has highlighted the work that you do. So, as someone who really looks at downtown environments, I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and your experiences are wonderfully sort of connected to some of my experiences as well. My first job I actually had was in Washington, D.C. for the National Capital Planning. So I know D.C. very well. I didn't stay there that long, and now I'm working there.
Downtowns are an incredible mix of people and constituents and constituencies, people of different ethnicities, races, classes, financial backgrounds. And, the places that they inhabit really have to be designed with multiple users in mind. And so I'm curious what role you think public art and landscape architecture in particular play in creating a shared experience, and how can it overcome the divides that often split people apart?
The question that you bring up, I think it's, public space, the spaces that we share are the most democratic, how can I say, environments that we have in this country. And so to not invest in them begins to suggest that we don't really believe in democracy to a certain degree, which is a kind of a shared experience for all people. And when we think of public, the public is really about people. And I think the first thing that we're beginning to sort of deal with now with, post-COVID, this sort of civil rights moment is, how do we talk about the 20th century as a time where we spent a lot of capital to live separately, right? And we did that through planning. We did that through, a lot of choice, but we created these institutions that literally allowed us to exist separately. And then over the last 50 years, we've tried to figure out a way to live together, but we haven't created any new institutions to do that, if you think about it. So the public spaces are that test to a certain degree, right? It's the places that we're seeing. In the 80s, we saw the rise in homelessness, right? And again, from a lot of brown people and white people as well, but this notion that class all of a sudden shifted, right? How we actually think about class. And so again, poor and poverty, we kind of look at that again as something really separate that we don't want to somehow make a part of our public realm. 20 years ago, we did a project here in Oakland called Lafayette Square. And we advocated, we said, we have to look at poor people as well as rich people. And we had this idea, it's like, we want to have the suits meeting with the common folk. And of course, it didn't happen. But that didn't stop us from investing in restrooms. And those restrooms are still there today, 20 years. It's the only public restroom in the city, which begins to tell you, it's like, we're not then thinking about those things, right? We're not thinking about ways in which we can take care of, I don't want to use the term diversity, but the different people who are in the public realm, which is different than diversity, right? Difference will force us to make different decisions versus diversity. We just change the color of things. So I do think, I'm optimistic, but I do think we have to take chances. We have to take chances that we're not taking.
I'm curious about your process for determining, how to respond to these different constituencies. Who's at the table? How does a place get developed and defined in partnership with communities? And could you speak to how you think about the role that communities play in public design?
It's, I always tease my students about this sometimes when I'm giving a presentation at a college or say, there's Walter cares about people. And I'm like, no one else cares about people? So it's almost like this subtext. So he does participatory work. And I think that's the work that we have to do. Again, I talked about the mid 20th century, but when we think of urban renewal, these are moments when people were not involved in deciding how to create their community. It was a top-down decision-making, eminent domain, freeways and all of that. And so there's a lot of distrust in community. And so if I go into a community and go, oh, we're going to get something new, people are not trustful that they're going to be part of the process. And what we've, I wouldn't say figured out, what we challenge ourselves to do, every community is unique, every community is different, and we come up with different ways in which to engage the community. We're working in St. Louis right now on a 1-mile trail through a Black neighborhood, and we're using, music and religion as a way to talk about design. We have a call and response. We have crossroads. We have multiple rhythms, but it's a way to get people to say, wow, they're going out of their way to think about us in a different way. So we never do the same process twice. Right? We always give people scenarios, like we're working in San Francisco now in Freedom West. And our client was surprised that we said, no, we want to make 5 big models, and we're going to have 5 different scenarios based on 5 speculative ideas, heroes, towers. And they're like, wow, we've never thought about it that way. But again, looking at communities and saying there's something here, and we just need you to sort of see it. And in a way, we're trying to again, see that people, that they can take us serious in that we want to invest in them. And we want to invest in their ideas and their spirit. And as a designer and an artist, I can't do the work without people. I mean, I can make work in my studio, but it's going to be only Walter inspired.
Having worked in the public sector for so many years, often participation is about checking a box. It's not necessarily meaningful. You want to go out, say you did it. And do you have any strategies or suggestions for how to make that participation meaningful?
You have to treat it like it's the first time. You can't take something from somewhere else and bring it here. And that's my critique about placemaking and these other terminologies that we use. Placemaking suggests there's nothing there, and therefore I have to bring something in. If I go to the environment, something has always happened in a place, right? Like if I think of DC, DC is a mythical city, right? It lives on a fiction, right? Its fiction is it's a city on the hill. It's a city in a swamp. But through that fiction, it's able to sort of create this identity that's actually harmful in some ways to its future, and also I think harmful to some people. It's demographic. I know I teach about the alley dwellings in the early part of the 20th century. Southern African Americans came to DC for work, and they lived in these amazing alleys, and they were segregated. Those alley dwellings today are worth millions of dollars, some of these. But that recognition, right, is part of a different kind of story. And so I think every time we meet with the community, we have to show that we're looking at them, and that's through the history, that's through these fictions, but it's very particular to place. And even within a city, places are different within a city. So if you got Northwest, Southwest, very different places.
It sort of brings up a question, how do you determine whose story gets told here? And for those who may not be familiar with your work, you often state that your work exists at the intersection of history, culture, and I love the term place remembering. So as a practitioner who conspicuously and consciously weaves stories into the substance of your work, how do you determine, what gets put in and what gets left out? I love the example of Cobb Park in Mount Vernon, where, it might have been named after one of the first female Black officers in the city, but we don't know that story. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you define the story that gets told through your work and what ends up in and what ends up out?
Yeah. Well, that's easy for me. I mean, I'm a Black man in America. And so in a lot of places, my ancestors are never remembered. And that's just been a challenge for me to kind of take on, bringing my ancestors, to life in place. And that's just me as one voice. There are other voices out there that can exhume other ancestors that might be particular to them. But for me, it's been, just starting out even in design and reading through the history books, it was never really about me or my ancestors. And at a certain moment, I was like, well, why is that the case? and just thinking in different ways. And again, whether they're mythical ways or whether they're just real concrete history, I do think we can imbue spaces with stories and narratives that help us kind of think about democracy, think about difference. And I just think we just need other stories. Like, I mean, we have a lot of stories out there in the environment, particularly in DC. I mean, you can just walk around DC, there's stories everywhere, but there are not a lot of stories of our stories. They're not, like we're working on the tidal basin, and I didn't know the tidal basin when it first was designed in like its third imagination, it had a beach, but the beach was segregated, and it was segregated. And then people wanted to integrate the beach. They got rid of the beach, right? And so it's just like, wow, that's a great story, you know? And so part of our design we were doing for the tidal basin as part of this think tank, we said, okay, let's talk about swamps. Let's talk about the hush harbors. Let's talk about, you know, all of these kinds of spaces in which my ancestors inhabited, you know, so that we might bring some of these things to light. And it's not going back and critiquing, but it's just kind of imbuing places, right, with other ways that people might see them. You know, Theodore Roosevelt Island, I didn't know anything about the island, but evidently a lot of the during the Civil War, a lot of the Black soldiers had to live on that island because of fear of being killed by other white soldiers. And so these are the kinds of stories that I'm interested in bringing out because they just make our history much more complex. And complexity to me allows us to basically, again, be more diverse as a culture.
Yeah. Sort of another area I wanted to dig into, neighborhood change, what some people call gentrification. I don't like to use that word really because it means so many different things to different people. It's often a pejorative, but you know, we know urban places change, and we know the decisions that we make to invest in those places, to develop policies for those places affects that. You know, in my role as a city planning commissioner, we for the city of New York, we're often in a position to, you know, approve rezonings and investments in neighborhoods that sometimes people see as a harbinger of you know, displacement. And often, you know, wonderful new park and wonderful new public space is seen as a sign that displacement is coming. And so communities of color are often resistant to improvements, at least in my experience. And you know, how do we disaggregate these two things? How do we prevent some of the negative impacts that communities might perceive or feel as a result of improvements to place?
I mean, that's a tough question. And I think a lot of communities are trying to deal with this issue of, how can I say, disinvestment in a place that we've completely disinvested it for like 100 years. Like all of a sudden, one little investment is going to seem very strange because all you've been doing is not investing in me. So I'm going to be very weary of you doing anything. But I do think we have to start at the basic level of getting people, again, I go back to this thing of democracy, right? There's an article in the Times today about, well, why are wealthy people, why do they get more trees than poor people, right? And they did this survey of just looking on a satellite. It's like, you know, the suburbs have more trees than, like, we know that because we haven't invested. So one way is just simple things like we can invest in planting trees, right? Just to start on these baseline conditions to get people to see that we're thinking about them. And I don't think that planting trees are going to gentrify my neighborhood, but I want you to come in and plant them, how can I say, with a reason, with force. Don't come and plant 3 trees, plant 1,000 trees, right? And so these are the simple things that we're trying to do. The other piece is, as we invest, even in these small things, we have to think about how to get people who are there, how to make sure that they get something out of those investments. And so certain strategies that we're looking at here is subsidizing first-time homeowners in certain places for triplexes, right? So that you can basically get a subsidy to buy a triplex that will give you added income. in your single family, which was a single family dwelling, which will allow you then to accrue capital on your investment. And that's one of the biggest things that we see in our neighborhoods, is that by not investing in those neighborhoods, the value then of that real estate has actually devalued. So people who've lived there for 30, 40 years, their land is actually devalued for them until those improvements come back in. I've been living in West Oakland now. My office has been here 25 years, and people have been saying it's gentrifying. And one of the issues I have with the nonprofits on my block, they're all, how can I say, faith-based, service-based nonprofits, and they can't see bringing market rate into my neighborhood. And for 25 years, there's been no investment. And all of a sudden, they're building more subsidized housing. And then they have retail at the bottom. And you go like, well, who's going to be in that retail, right? And so who are you really serving? And so I think we have to think about these things in a more diverse way, but we have to make sure people who are there get equity in some way. And I think people just need to see it.
Yeah. You know, you're talking retail, you're talking my language.
Well, it behooves me. It behooves me, like, you know, there is a wonderful historic building, you know, on my block, and it's an SRO, but it has this amazing cultural history because during segregation, it was the only places where, you know, people could come and sing Aretha Franklin and things like that. So instead of like using that as an asset, it's almost as if that's not that important and these other things are important. And all I just hope is that we can somehow figure out how to leverage these things together.
Yeah. We have time for sort of one more series of questions. And I wanted to really focus on something I see as very practical. You know, the question of maintenance, and organizations like business improvement districts are often the ones providing enhanced maintenance for these wonderful places and spaces that are designed. So, you know, how do you approach this question when you're working with clients who have to understand the resources and the commitment it takes to maintain wonderful spaces and places over time?
Well, it's unfortunate that, you know, collectively, we don't see, again, our parks and public spaces as something that we want to invest in collectively. And if you don't have a bid, if you don't have another nonprofit doing that, these places, there's just no money to do it. And so one thing that we try to work with in the beginning is to get cities, first of all, to see that these investments are important long-term, and that if you don't have a department to do it, you gotta look at the budget, and you got to have that money to take care of it. And we're always looking at over 10, 15-year period of time of what those improvements are going to be. Unfortunately, in a lot of neighborhoods of brown and black people, this idea of low maintenance becomes so prominent that it takes everything out. Mm-hmm. So you see our environments are made of concrete, asphalt, those kinds of things, because people are going, it's no low maintenance. And what we try to get people to think about is, low maintenance is not through the materials. It's actually through how you actually think of the space. So if I go back to Lafayette Square, right? 25 years ago, the space is still there, held together. But what we did was we wanted to make sure that the materials that we use were not the standardized. So we use stone. Stone is something that's going to be here for a long time. So we use materials in a way so that we thought about, okay, if it's not going to get taken care of at this level, we want a patina at least, right? And so there's another way to kind of think about how you care for things. And I always think about Europe or other age-old places where you go to, where kind of, how can I say, aging is part of the process. In America, we like stuff shiny all the time. Right. And I just think if you just have that different ethic in how you think about things, and so I use the term messy, sometimes landscapes need to be messy to a certain degree. And so that helps in trying to imagine, how to care for places. Mm-hmm.
Well, Walter, I think that's our time.
Well, I hope I answered your questions, all of them. I mean, they're very complex. I think all of these things are very complex. And I struggle with what are those new things that we can do out in the world that can bring us together. And I think, maybe this generation will allow those things to happen. But I just think we can't just keep building parks, keep building, streets and expect people, to kind of play together. I think we have to really do things that, how can I say, get people to see that we have a future together, right? And I think those are through these new stories that we tell, through these new mythologies that we can do, through these new ways we can dream about space collectively.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Walter. I really appreciate your time, and I hope we have a chance to connect again.
Sounds great. I'm sure we will, Larissa. And this was a pleasure. This was my pleasure.
Thank you.